Stewart. I'm the communications coordinator for the New Hampshire Food Alliance. We are a statewide network that supports and connects people in growing a sustainable and fair and thriving local food system here in New Hampshire. You are here at one of our network cafes. This is our first network cafe of 2023 and our third in our 2022-2023 series. So really excited to have this here today on this Friday. A couple more things before we really get into what we are going to discuss today. The New Hampshire Food Alliance is a part of the Sustainability Institute at UNH. We're very proud of that. And with all of that comes some interesting collaborations and things that we work on together with students, with our community. And part of our mission is bringing all the great things that happen at the Sustainability Institute into our community here in New Hampshire. So that's what this is a part of. Before we get started, I want to just acknowledge that the New Hampshire Food Alliance and the University of New Hampshire believes diversity, equity, accessibility, and inclusion are foundational values inextricably linked to achieving our core educational mission and embracing the many characteristics of our community members that make them uniquely themselves. And in that vein, we also wish to acknowledge the spiritual and physical connection the Pennacook, Abenaki, and Wabanaki peoples have maintained to Indakana, which the University of New Hampshire community is honored to steward today. And if you are interested in reading the full land, water, and life acknowledgement from UNH, that is linked in our agenda. Also, something to take note of is our community agreement, and as well as our evaluation, which I will ask you all to take at the end of our network cafe today. But our community agreement is important. It's an outline of what we expect here and what you should expect from us. And you're welcome to make comments about that and talk with us about it offline if needed. Last thing I want to go through before we again get into the meat of the day is our desired outcomes for the day. So we're hoping to develop a shared understanding of current peer-reviewed data that shows about the carbon footprint of our different food choices. Identify areas of overlap and alignment between that understanding and our work to strengthen New Hampshire's food system, and then do a little brainstorming about takeaways that will help the Food Alliance and our partners communicate clearly and accurately about climate-friendly eating, because that's what we're here to talk about. So generally our network cafe series, they occur on the first Friday of each month, September through April. And they serve as an informal, lively conversation with our partners about different food system topics. But this year, we are have a little theme going on. It's based off of how do we build a climate resilient food system in New Hampshire, 6 ways that sustainable food systems build climate resilience. It's a long title, but it's very important. And it's a framework that we developed with our climate action team to get our network aligned and working towards moving our food system into helping build climate resilience in New Hampshire. And so we've been using each month of our Network Cafe series to dig into one of those 6 ways that it's in that framework. So today our topic is climate-friendly eating, which can quickly be summed up as understanding the carbon footprint of our food choices and how what we choose to eat has a direct impact on our climate. We discovered as a team, a backbone team, that this concept is deceivingly simple and extremely complex when you really dig into it. So that's why we're really excited to bring it to you today as a network. It can be complex because when we lay over our food system values over this science and the data of carbon footprint of food and agricultural production, things get a little sticky. So we're gonna dive into that with Dr. Leach, who's one of our colleagues at SI, and she's gonna help us, use data to gain a better understanding of the carbon footprint and how they're related to our food choices. And then, with that knowledge in hand, we're gonna be joined by Nancy LaRowe of Vital Communities. She's gonna help us answer questions, discuss, talk, and hopefully develop some clear understandings and maybe messaging that we can use to talk about this relationship between carbon footprint and food choices and how we can embrace that in supporting our local food system and reducing our impact on the climate. I'm really excited about this because I think this is one of our best, or one of the only network cafes in this series that we can make an impact as soon as we log off here. Like, we all make food choices every single day. I'm gonna eat lunch right after this, and I have a choice of what I want to eat and where it comes from and how it's made and how it's grown. And we all have that choice. So that's I think a really empowering way to view this topic that can, again, be a little complex. So I'm going to introduce Allie really quick to everyone. And her bio is a little bit long, but I think it's so, so important. And I'm going to read it from a little bit from the UNH website. And I urge you to go read more because I think we're so excited and valued to have her as a part of the SI team. But Dr. Allison Leach is the SciMap program manager with UNH Sustainability Institute. She is the developer of the nitrogen footprint approach, and she is a co-developer of SciMap, the campus carbon and nitrogen footprint tool hosted by the UNH Sustainability Institute. Allie leads the research, new development, intern recruitment, and support, outreach, and user support for SciMap, which is a lot. She is also the co-instructor for the newly launched Carbon Clinic and the PD&T Carbon Footprinting Certificate. And her dissertation from her studies was titled The Nitrogen Challenge, Footprint Tools and On-Farm Solutions. So I like to think she is a great, great, great guest to have, and I'm happy to introduce her and let her take the mic for her presentation.
Okay, well, thank you so much, Colleen, for that great introduction and also for the context that you provided to start us off with this discussion today. So I'm going to share my screen here. Let's see, actually, could you enable screen sharing, Colleen? There we go. Okay, great. So I am so excited to be here with you all today to talk about food and the environment and sustainability. I think this is one of my favorite topics to talk about, and I'm so excited for the discussion. And I think it's a really important one, as Colleen said. It's one where we can all log off today and make a change. You know, we can all have an impact on with our everyday food choices on the environment and on climate. So we're really going to be covering 3 topics today: the environmental impacts of food production, looking at how food production releases greenhouse gas emissions, and then looking at a few other environmental impacts as well, because it's not just greenhouse gas emissions that we see from food production. There are a few other environmental impacts as well that are related, all part of the same system. And we're going to use environmental footprints as a way to compare across food types, and then focus in on what we can do, what we can all do as individuals to reduce our personal impact with our food choices. And wanted to share a little bit more about the perspective that I come to this work with. Most of my work has been from the footprinting side. So as Colleen said, I'm the program manager now for a tool called SciMap that we host here at UNH. It's a tool for organizations to calculate their carbon and nitrogen footprints used by higher ed and a number of nonprofits and municipalities and small businesses. And so part of that calculation is food. So we have calculations for the carbon emissions and nitrogen emissions from food purchases at an organization that uses SciMap. And a lot of my work has been with that kind of top-down footprinting perspective, looking at the national or international perspective with a modeling approach. I've also come to this work from another perspective as well. From my master's work and my PhD work, I worked on a couple of farms, looking at the nitrogen budget and nitrogen cycling within those farms. One of those was a permaculture livestock farm in Virginia, and then also had the opportunity to work at UNH's organic dairy research farm as part of my PhD work. So I both did an overall nitrogen budget for that farm and also did research at our heat recovery compost facility, looking at some of the flows there and the emissions that were released at that innovative facility. And so I'm coming at this work with kind of these 2 different perspectives, but most of my work has been at this footprinting scale. Okay, so with that, let's dive in. So I really like to start at the very beginning for this topic, and I think this is a piece that that this group is going to be very familiar with, but still I think it's important to state. And that's the incredible value that we get from food, that food is central to life, that we all need it, of course, to survive for life. Also for our health, our dietary choices have tremendous impacts on our health and can improve our health. And that it's not just that, it's not just food for survival and health, that we also get these other incredible benefits from food, that it's central to our culture and to our quality of life. Food brings people together. I mean, we just came out of the holidays here, and that food is often a very central part of many of our holiday gatherings. And so there's these tremendous benefits that we, of course, get from food that cannot be overstated. And here we've got a figure here showing that there are many mouths to feed in our world. So we have, as you all know, a growing global population, and with the growing global population, that means more food that needs to be produced and more food that has been produced. And so we've seen tremendous increases in food production rates over the past decades, over the past century, which has been the result of a lot of innovation and scientific advances. And at the same time, we've also seen increasing demand for meat production, meat products in particular. On this graph that I have here is showing in the top panel the global consumption rate for meat increasing from 1960 through 2010. And the lower panel is showing those same figures, but by region. And what this graph is really showing, this one on the bottom, is that as countries develop and begin to accumulate wealth, that they begin to also consume more meat products, luxury products. In particular, we see that there's increase in China and also in Asia. That's where we're seeing this large increasing demand for meat consumption. And as you all see, and we get into some of the details comparing across food products, that meat production is often more resource intensive and has more environmental impact. So not only is there this demand for more food, but this more resource intensive food. So how do we meet that demand? So modern agriculture has brought us tremendous benefits, that we're producing more food than ever before. Things that were previously limiting for agriculture, like nitrogen fertilizer, we now have solutions to that. We can produce synthetic fertilizer, industrial fertilizer, so it's no longer a limiting nutrient for food production, of course, with some consequences with overuse, but that it's no longer a limiting nutrient for our food production. That we have a lot of new agricultural technologies that are more resource efficient. And that one benefit of intensification is that it saves land, where we can produce more food on the same area of land. But that there are lots of trade-offs and drawbacks to modern agriculture. We have this challenge of producing more food, more fiber, and these competing interests like producing biofuel, and need to produce those additional products while also making sure we're keeping all of these other aspects in mind, alleviating rural poverty, improving diets and health, increasing environmental, or at least maintaining environmental resources at a minimum for future generations, and doing all of that while trying to combat climate change. And so this is a lot. This is a big challenge, and our food system is central to a lot of this. And so I wanted to take a look at a brief tour of how food production impacts our environment. So as I started this off, that food is central to our lives, and it makes sense that that so much of our land and so much of our resources go towards food production, but this has impacts as well. This has consequences for our environment. And here I have a list of 5 environmental impacts, and we'll focus on the first, greenhouse gas emissions, but also wanted to take a quick look at 4 others that are all related because it's all part of the same system. And you'll see that there's really co-benefits for a lot of the solutions for reducing these environmental impacts, that we don't see too many trade-offs or pollution swapping across these. So the first of these is greenhouse gas emissions, then nutrient pollution, so nitrogen and phosphorus pollution, biodiversity loss, fresh water consumption, and land use. So I'm going to start off here with greenhouse gas emissions and the sources of greenhouse gases from food production. So these are the major sources, and there are others. So starting at the beginning here, we've got enteric fermentation, and that is the scientific term, the fancy term for cow burps. So just because of the biology of cows and the foods that they eat, they burp methane. And that's an issue for two reasons. One is that methane is a greenhouse gas, and so it has a warming effect. But it's not only a greenhouse gas, it's also a very potent greenhouse gas. So on a 20-year time scale, the warming effect of methane is actually over 80 times greater than the warming effect of CO2. So every amount of methane that we're releasing has a larger impact than CO2 and can be very impactful from a warming perspective. Another important one to keep in mind is manure management. And there's lots of different ways for manure management systems to reduce emissions, but that there are usually going to be some emissions from manure management, that there's some volatilization or release of two major greenhouse gases, nitrous oxide and methane. So again, methane is a potent greenhouse gas, and nitrous oxide is actually even more potent. So impacts almost 300 times greater than CO2. Less nitrous oxide is usually released than methane, but that it is a potent greenhouse gas, so any amount is going to be impactful. And we also have some general soil respiration effects from microbial activity in our soils. And a really important one is on a global scale. It's maybe one that we don't see quite as much in the US, but in areas like the Amazon, where it can be very significant, is deforestation. And this is a big issue when land is cleared, especially forested land, for food production. And that's because it really has two effects. One is that you're clearing out land that previously was a carbon sink. So by clearing out land for food production and cutting down trees, clear cutting, you're removing what was a carbon sink. And in some parts of the world, like in the Amazon, that's an area that is a particularly large carbon sink and has climate regulating effects. So the more of that we clear out, the less of a climate regulating effect we're going to see from the Amazon. So we're removing a carbon sink and then turning that land into something that will become a carbon source, especially if it's used for something like meat production. And last one that I want to mention here that is also very significant is food waste. And sure, a topic that you all are very familiar with, that globally and in the US, we waste over 30% of our food. And an important way to think about that is it's not just the food itself that we're wasting, it's all of the emissions that happened before that food was produced. So we're not just throwing away the food itself and seeing the emissions from that food decomposing in our landfills. We're also essentially wasting those emissions upstream are still happening, right? So all of those emissions across the supply chain are still happening. And then that food isn't even being consumed. And so that's a really big opportunity, really, where, well, we'll talk about this later on, but where we don't even need to change our diets. If we better manage our food waste, that we can have a really big impact on reducing environmental effects from food. And if you're interested in reading more about this, there was a great IPCC special report that came out a few years ago called Climate Change and Land that went a lot into some of these topics. So then what you're probably wondering is, what do these emissions look like compared to global greenhouse gas emissions? So how big a contribution does food have to global greenhouse gas emissions? And then how does that break out across the supply chain and across food types? So this is from a paper in Nature Food on Cripp et al. From last year, 2021, where they were looking at global emissions, global greenhouse gas emissions in 2015, and found that food was about a third of that. And this aligns really well with what I found in other sources from the IPCC and other resources. So this is a pretty good representation of an estimate of global emissions, where food is making up about 1/3 of global greenhouse gas emissions. So that's significant. That's a large proportion. And if we then break that out across the supply chain, we see that the first major source is land use. So that's where things like deforestation come into play, land use change. Agricultural production is, as you might expect, the biggest. So that's those on-farm emissions. Those are the emissions that are occurring while the food is being produced. Then everything else is across the supply chain. So the biggest piece here is food waste, but that there's small emissions along the way for the supply chain. But what this, I think this graph really underscores, is that most of these emissions are occurring on the farm, and that land use is an important piece as well to keep in mind for this. And there's another paper that came out a couple years ago now that was looking at what we need to do to meet the goals set in Paris, the greenhouse gas reduction goals, trying to keep warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius. And what they were doing is looking at what, if any, changes would be necessary to our food system to achieve that target. And so they did this big global modeling analysis where they looked at a number of different scenarios and said, what if we're able to just cut out energy emissions almost entirely? Like, what would we be able to achieve that target? And really, they found that the answer was no, that we will need to make changes to our food system to keep warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius. And so I think this just really underscores how central our food system is to achieving our climate goals, that really we will need to make changes. And there's no one single change, as we'll see later on, that there'll need to be changes across our supply chain and to our dietary choices to really achieve the global targets that we're trying to achieve to avoid more climate impacts. And there is work being done on this at the international scale through conventions. Food is getting more attention now. And this is relatively recent. Food and agriculture weren't really being discussed in some of the early COP meetings. And the COP meetings are the annual international meetings where nations come together to discuss climate change negotiations. And Paris was one of these COP meetings. And two years ago, in 2021, there was a meeting in Glasgow where many countries signed on and agreed for the first time to target methane emissions in particular. And this is significant for agriculture because agriculture is one of the major sources of methane emissions from things like cow burps, enteric fermentation, and manure management. So agriculture, in addition to waste, are really some of the major sources of methane emissions. And so to achieve these 30% reduction targets, agriculture will need to be part of that story. And there hasn't been too much progress made on these yet. I believe it's at the stage where countries are putting together their plans for how they would achieve it, but it was still a really big deal that countries came together and said, we're going to do something about methane, because producing methane emissions can have such a big impact because it's such a potent greenhouse gas. And then at the most recent COP meeting in Egypt this past fall, food was on the agenda. And so this was big. Food hadn't really been on the agenda before. And so food and agriculture were part of the discussion. And again, it's one where there weren't any agreements necessarily made at this most recent meeting, but that it was part of the discussion and part of the agenda. So that was essential. So work is happening at the international scale now on this topic. And wanted to briefly just look at a couple of other environmental impacts here before we get into our footprint comparison. And one of those is nutrient pollution. And this is where a lot of my background is from, around nitrogen footprints and nutrient pollution. And when I talk about nutrient pollution, I'm talking about nitrogen and phosphorus and other nutrients. And this is a challenging one because we need nutrients to grow our crops. So I'm sure this is something that you all are very familiar with, that we need to apply fertilizer, either as a synthetic fertilizer or organic fertilizer, like compost and like manure. But that those same nutrients, most of those nutrients don't actually end up in the crops that we're trying to grow. And those same nutrients, when they get in the environment, they then accumulate in the environment where they can contribute to a cascade of negative environmental impacts. What we've got here is a picture in the background of an algal bloom. And so nutrient pollution is the driver of algal blooms in bodies of water. And in eutrophication in bodies of water. And there's a number of other environmental impacts that we see from excess nutrients that accumulate in the environment, like water acidification. And for nitrogen, we see other impacts like air quality impacts and even stratospheric ozone depletion. And what's particularly unique about nitrogen is that with the invention of industrial synthetic fertilizer, we removed nitrogen as a limiting ingredient for food production. So it used to be that we had these limited natural reserves, but over 100 years ago, scientists figured out how to manufacture ammonia so we could make fertilizer and apply it to our crop fields. And so removed it as a limiting ingredient or a limiting nutrient, but it also has meant that we now have applied a lot of nitrogen to our fields, and that humans are now actually creating 2 to 4 times as much, it's called reactive nitrogen than nature. So we've contributed to this huge alteration of the global nitrogen cycle, and a lot of that nitrogen is then accumulating in the environment where it's causing environmental impacts. One other topic I wanted to chat about briefly here was biodiversity loss. And this is another interesting one because agriculture can cause biodiversity loss for certain types of agriculture, but that we also need biodiversity in our agricultural systems for a resilient agricultural system. So the impacts that we see in terms of biodiversity loss are usually from big conventional or monoculture farms. So it's things like habitat loss, where we're clearing land for food production, and we have habitat loss for species, overexploitation for fishery systems, where we're depleting our fishing stocks. And pesticide use is a really big one, because pesticide use causes impacts to pollinators, and we need pollinators for our food system. We rely on them. And so by using pesticides, we then hurt the pollinators that we rely on for diverse food production. And so we need agricultural biodiversity for a number of reasons. And one is just ensuring that we can produce food, fiber, and fuel, that our flowering crops rely on those pollinators. And it also gives us resilience to changing conditions. So for example, with climate change, as regions warm, for example, pests and diseases that weren't previously in certain regions will now be able to extend further to new regions. And if we have monoculture systems, if we don't have a lot of biodiversity, we're going to be much more susceptible to those types of impacts and threats. And so biodiversity gives us more resilience to a changing system as we start to see new potential threats. Water scarcity is one that I know we don't think about very much in New England, since we usually are not, I know we had a drought just this past summer, but usually do not have very many water limitations in the region, but that many parts of the world do experience water scarcity. And I noticed that this map is a little out of date here. I imagine that if we had a more recent map, we would see more of the Western US would be considered to be in a level of water scarcity with the droughts that we've seen over the last decade in that region. And agriculture is our really largest, by far, consumer of freshwater use, which is really a limited resource in many ways. And so this graph on the right is showing a breakdown of freshwater use across all uses, where you can see arable land is the largest, and that's cropland, both for crops for human consumption and also feed crops. Livestock, and then the remaining sectors are municipal and industrial. So really most of our freshwater consumption is going to agriculture. And our very last environmental impact topic here before we get into our footprint comparisons is land use. And here we have a figure showing land use across the globe again, and that agriculture occupies about 40% of our global land. So a really large proportion of our land that's dedicated to food production in some way. So how do we make sense of all that information? How do we boil that down to something that can help us make climate-friendly dietary decisions? So we can use footprints to compare across food types. And what are footprints? So footprints describe the pressure on the environment from resource consumption. And there's a number of different footprints. We'll be looking at a few of these today in our comparisons. One of those is the water footprint, which is freshwater consumption. The carbon footprint is kind of shorthand for greenhouse gas emissions during food production. So when I refer to the carbon footprint, I'm not just talking about carbon dioxide. It also includes methane and nitrous oxide and other greenhouse gases. Nitrogen footprint, which is nitrogen pollution during food production, and the land footprint, which is the land area used for food production. So this graph is then showing the water, carbon, and nitrogen footprint for major food categories, and all on the same axis here, normalized. So water, 1 droplet of water shows a liter of water. 1 CO2 cloud shows a kilogram of carbon dioxide equivalents, which includes normalized greenhouse gases like methane and nitrous oxide. And 1 bag of fertilizer shows a gram of nitrogen. And these are all per 1 kilogram of food. And so looking across these, the first thing you can see is that there's some pretty consistent trends. And this holds true for other footprints as well. If we were to look at the land footprint, the phosphorus footprint, where on average, if a food has a large carbon footprint, it's also going to have a large water footprint and a large nitrogen footprint, and vice versa, which is good news really for dietary choices. So there aren't too many trade-offs. If we're going to make a dietary choice for a climate-friendly diet, it's also probably going to have good impacts for your nitrogen footprint, for your water footprint, for other environmental impacts as well. The other thing that I think comes through in this is that the animal-based products have larger footprints than the plant-based products. And this really just comes down to the supply chain and what goes into producing our animal products. So when we're producing meat or an animal product, we need to grow a crop and then the animal. So there's more steps on the supply chain, more resources that are needed, and more steps across the supply chain where losses can occur, where emissions can occur, where resources are needed. So it's really just an inherent difference in these production systems. And it is, of course, possible to move the needle a little bit for these, right? So that these figures that I'm showing here are averages for the US, so averages across the entire US. And it is possible, of course, with sustainable and regenerative practices to make reductions to any of these. But the differences across food products, across food types, just due to the biology of the animals and of the crops themselves, the differences across food types are almost always going to be larger than the differences within a food category from changing products. So we can reduce this beef number, but that the beef footprint is almost always going to be larger than a pork footprint and a poultry footprint.
Allie, I'm gonna just hop in for 1 second to raise, I want to save the questions for the end, but I just want to raise 2 specific questions about this graph, if you're okay. And they're the last 2 questions in the chat. They're specific to clarifications for this graph. So one is, do the values for fish, do you know if the seafood includes both wild caught and farmed? And the second, I'll just read the second one and then you can answer both. And then beef, does beef mean those raised using CAFOs or only beef using, or does beef also include cattle raised using regenerative practices?
Yep, great question. So for the seafood one, this is wild caught and farmed fish. So it's an average for the US, and it's about an even split for consumption in the US, where about half is wild caught and half is farmed fish. And most of the impacts that we see from a resource perspective, from an emissions perspective, are from farmed fish, because wild caught fish, there's not a feed component. We're not growing feed as well. The emissions really just occur after the fish is caught. So most of the emissions that you're seeing here and the impacts that you're seeing here from fish are from farmed fish, although it is an average. So if it were just farmed fish, it would actually be a little bit larger. And the beef footprint is an average for the US. And so that means it's mostly going to be conventional production, since most of the production in the US is going to be conventional production. And so it would include organic farms and regenerative practices in the US, but it's really just a weighted average across the entire US. And I don't have these slides as part of the presentation, but I have a couple of comparative graphs that we could look at later on across some of these the differences within categories from different farming practices. Okay, great questions. So now what we're going to turn to is climate-friendly diets. So what do we do with this information from footprints, and how can we apply some of these what sort of dietary choices can we apply to our everyday life to reduce our personal impact and have a more sustainable diet? So first, I wanted to look at a couple of diet scenarios. And so these diet scenarios come from a report from the World Resources Institute called Shifting Diets for a Sustainable Food Future. And what they did was they looked at 4 different diets and looked at the land footprint and the carbon footprint associated with those diets. And for the diets that they identified, they ensured that they were all nutritionally adequate, so that the calorie levels were about the same across all 4 diets, and that all nutritional needs and health needs were being met from those diets. So they were all healthy diets. And then they calculated the land footprint and the greenhouse gas footprint for those diets. The 4 diets are a US reference diet, so the current US average diet, a US traditional Mediterranean diet, so a diet that has less meat, more plants, and some switches within the meat category, so more of an emphasis on seafood, for example. The ambitious beef reduction diet reduces beef, still has meat as part of the diet, and increases plants. And then there's a vegetarian diet. And you can see the colors at the bottom here that are used in the graph. So in this first one, we're looking at land use in acres across for the US diet, and each little square here shows acres. And so you can see that a small part of it is from plants, and that the majority is really from beef in red, dairy in orange, and some other animal-based foods. And so as you might have expected, that the land requirement kind of decreases across these, that we see a pretty big land area reduction just from the Mediterranean footprint, from some dietary switches, an even larger reduction from the US ambitious beef reduction diet, and the footprint, or the land footprint, is really cut in half for the vegetarian diet. So that's a huge reduction, cutting in half the amount of land required for an individual's diet. And the second one here is greenhouse gas emissions in tons of carbon dioxide equivalents. And so the US average diet is at 1.4 metric tons of carbon dioxide equivalents. And the story is the same across the other 3 diets here, where we see reductions across every single one. And these reductions, even if everyone were to switch, for example, to the traditional Mediterranean diet, these reductions across the board would be significant, right? That really would add up across an entire population. And so I think this really underscores the impact of our dietary choices, how much of an impact they can have on land use and greenhouse gas emissions. Food waste, we talked about a little bit earlier, but as you all know, we waste a lot of food globally, about a third of it. And this is equivalent to 1.3 billion tons of edible food on a global basis. That this contributes to a lot of greenhouse gas emissions, a lot of water use, and land area. And that what's really important to remember here is that we're not just throwing away the food, we're essentially throwing away all of those upstream emissions that are occurring too, that those emissions are occurring anyway, and then the food, the product, is not even being consumed. So this is such a huge opportunity from a food management and diet perspective, just reducing our food waste. And very briefly here, I know we need to wrap up in just a couple minutes here. I wanted to highlight the Eat Lancet Commission report. This is a really nice report that came out a few years ago that pulled together the current science and understanding and tried to make sense of it all and make some recommendations for a global planetary health diet. And the leads on this, there's leads from all over the world, but one of the main leads most recently has been Johan Rockström, who's done a lot of the planetary boundaries work, looking at global systems and planetary health. And so what you're seeing here is the recommended diet that they came up with, but one of their major findings was that there's not a single diet. They didn't want to recommend a single diet for everybody, because they acknowledge that food serves so many benefits to our lives, that it's and there's so many different factors that go into deciding what we eat. And so they encourage diversity in our diets. Two of their major recommendations are choose health, sustainability, and deliciousness. So I think acknowledging that it's important that we like our food, right? It's important that we enjoy eating our food, and prepared to increase, diversify, and reduce. So reducing being an important one there, but just that they're emphasizing this diversifying our diets. And they had recommendations across what to eat, how to produce your food, and where to buy your food, or how to prepare your food rather. And so these all come straight from this report, and they've got a really nice brief that they prepared for consumers. And they've got briefs for farmers, for policymakers, for healthcare workers. These recommendations here all come straight from the brief for consumers. And I thought they were just really nice and a good overview of some key recommendations. And so again, encouraging diversity, dive into the breadth of options, embracing plants as a source of protein. So this was a key theme, that we should increase our plant consumption for health reasons and environmental reasons, and going easy on meat consumption, and approaching food in moderation. and where to buy your food. So they encourage folks to support regenerative farming practices, and that vote with every plate, that every time we're purchasing food, we're sending a signal. We're saying this is the kind of food we as consumers want to be eating. And so we're essentially voting for the types of food that we want to eat, that we want to have available, and encouraging biodiversity. And then how to prepare your food. They encourage planning ahead to reduce waste, cooking more at home for health reasons and as a way to reduce waste. And then waste not, want not. So reducing waste anywhere we can. So to summarize, we've covered a lot of ground here and wanted to come back to the point that food is central to our lives and brings so many values to our lives. And that agriculture also has impacts on our environment. This is a list of some of the ones that we went through here today about the ways that our food production system impacts the environment. And across these, that meat and animal products tend to have the largest impacts. And that there's a lot that we can do as individuals, as consumers, and that our dietary choices really do matter and do have an impact on our environment. And some of the key recommendations that have come out of the literature, that Eat Lancet report, those diet scenarios, are eating more plant-based food, reducing resource-intensive meat, and reducing food waste. So with that, I want to make sure we've got plenty of time for discussion here. I'd like to thank you all for your attention and looking forward to your questions. I see there's been lots of discussion in the chat, which is fantastic. So I was wondering, Nancy, if you had an idea of where we might start.
Yeah, I mean, I've tracked a couple of questions in the chat. Maybe we can stop sharing the screens is perfect. Thank you, Allie. So Nancy LaRowe, I work at Vital Communities in food and economy, and also former pasture-based livestock farmer. So I'm excited to be facilitating the conversation because it's near and dear to my heart. There were a couple questions in the chat. A lot of people had answers already in the chat. So I copied them in order. How important is food source in enteric fermentation methane release, if you happen to know that? That was one of the very first ones that was way early in the conversation. So.
Yeah, so that does matter. And there's a lot of great research happening actually right at UNH about how diets for cattle can reduce enteric fermentation. So some researchers at UNH are looking at some diets that I believe have like seaweed and kelp as part of the mixture that would actually reduce methane production. And so I don't know the degree to which that reduces it. I think there's ongoing research that looks into that, but that it can absolutely have an impact.
Super. And then the other one that was in the chat, Alan, if you're on, maybe this got answered. Alan, can you did your question get answered? It's about describe the percentages of greenhouse gas percentages.
Hi, Nancy. No, I don't know that it is. So I'll summarize. Thank you for an informative presentation. We hear 30% of agriculture, but another 60% is industry. 41% are passenger cars. That totals more than 100% of global. And I tried to make sure that I was looking at the global numbers. Is there that much discrepancy in interpretation?
Yeah, so another way of looking at this, and I went with the total graph from a single source, just because it makes it a little bit easier to talk about, but there's usually ranges. There's a lot of uncertainty in our understanding of the global totals. And so the IPCC, for example, says that food emissions, I believe it was on the order of like 21 to 37%. And so this report that I showed today was kind of right in the middle of that, about 1/3, but that there's uncertainty ranges for all of these, just because it can be so challenging to estimate greenhouse gas emissions at a global scale. These are estimates for a lot of greenhouse gas emissions. We're not actually out there measuring the emissions from a particular cow, from a particular car's tailpipe. We're estimating on a global basis. And that's why there's some uncertainty for these. So you're right that if you add up the numbers from different sources like that, it might exceed 100%. And that's why I showed from one source, but that there is just generally some uncertainty in this. I think the messages are still pretty clear, though, that on average, food is about 1/3, and that the remaining portion is non-food, so industry, fossil fuel, combustion primarily.
Great. And then I see Rachel has a hand up, but I'll just jump in with, there's a couple in the chat. How does local food tend to compare to non-local food across all of these footprints?
Yes, great question. And there's not always a clear answer. So it really depends on what's happening on the farm. And it comes down to the specific farm's practices. So if we're just thinking about local food from a distance perspective, so say we've got a conventional farm that's somewhere else in the Midwest, and we've got a local farm here, they're using the same practices. The only difference is the miles traveled. The local food is going to have a lower carbon footprint, but it's not going to be much lower. So those final transport emissions are actually a pretty small percentage of the overall footprint for a food product. Most of the emissions are actually happening on the farm, and and some due to processing and across the supply chain. So what really matters is what's happening on the farm, and that's why knowing your farmers and working and buying food from a farm that you know and understand their practices is important. So farmers that are using these regenerative practices that are recycling, that are reducing waste, are going to have lower emissions. But it's not necessarily a clear answer about whether local doesn't necessarily have a smaller footprint. It really depends on the farm's practices.
Great. Rachel, you have your hand raised.
Thanks. I just wanted to circle back to Alan's question. Alan, I'm not sure if you saw my answer to it in the chat, but if I'm looking at that graph correctly that Dr. Leach posted, you asked specifically about the energy sector. And so I think if you read the graph or the graphic as like concentric circles, it's saying in the middleest circle that energy is 73.2% of the whole budget, but the energy use in industry is 24.2% of that 73.2%. So if you add up all of the percentages, obviously it'll be more than 100, but as you go out, those are percentages of the things that are closer into the center, if that makes sense.
Thanks, Rachel. Alan?
Thanks very much, Rachel. I appreciate that. And what I will clarify very briefly. I only use that graph at the very end. When we hear discussions in general about greenhouse gas emissions globally, we hear these larger numbers like 30%, like 70, like 40, for significant categories like automobiles, that all of a sudden we're at 170%. And so wasn't sure if it was discrepancy. And of course, I'll leave it at that. Allison, that your clarification was certainly helpful on ranges. Thank you.
So there's a question from Edith in the chat. In calculating footprints, is the impact of transportation, processing, packaging, refrigeration, storage, the associated industrial food system included here? I think the answer is yes, but.
Yes. So most of these analyses are going to include that full supply chain. Most of the emissions, again, are happening on the farm, but there are emissions every single step of the way. So any processing, packaging, distribution, storage, all of that has emissions as well. So these analyses, like the carbon footprint analyses, they use an approach called life cycle assessment, where they're looking across the supply chain and looking at the emissions at each step along the way. And I'm just going to also add briefly that the results I was showing, they're also not just from one life cycle assessment. So because so many of these studies have been done, they're able to do now what's called a meta-analysis. So the results I was sharing are using lots of different studies, lots of different life cycle assessment studies, and looking at an average of those overall. So it's pulling together a lot of different studies across the literature.
Super. Andrew, you had a really good question. Want to pose it?
Sure. Hi. Thanks, Allison. Also, really love the SciMap program. I tried to implement it at a former school I worked at and really enjoyed learning more about that tool. So I just really appreciate this presentation on the impacts to greenhouse gas emissions from agriculture and the opportunities to mitigate that. This might be outside the scope of your work, but I'm curious if any of those agricultural products are more or less resilient to changing climate, making them better or worse investments for future growing for farmers from the adaptation side of things?
That's a great question. Does get a bit out of my area of expertise. I think the one thing I can say is that we want to make sure that we've got diversity in the types of foods that we're growing. So we want to make sure that we're growing a range of crops, not just a single crop, and also not just a single type of crop or species of crop. So corn, for example, we want to make sure that we're don't have fields and fields of the exact same genetic variety of corn, because then that's going to be very susceptible to, if there's a pest that can affect some of that, it could affect all of it, right? So having genetic diversity within crop types and then diversity across crop types is going to improve our resilience. But in terms of what specific crops might be more resilient and what we should choose to cite, I don't know the answer to that one.
Well, I do think this brings up the interesting, like the community regional food system resilience aspect. I mean, during COVID, everybody, food shelves tended to be empty, maybe not in the co-op food stores, but that, it was hard to get food. So people went to their local farmer because we had the food, and that's where our strength and resilience came from. So I do think that even aside from crop, that's like one of the local food system stories that we need to keep remembering, is that regional resilience in the face of climate disruptions that are ahead. We need a strong food system, which is it is crop, but the bigger question is the food system, the resilience part in the food system. So I think that was a great question.
Yeah, I fully agree with that. And I think that became very apparent in our with the supply chain issues and food challenges that we had during COVID, that we need a diversity in types of food providers as well. So that maybe there is still a role for the big farms because we have this big growing global population, but I think it just underscored how essential our regional farmers are, and that we need a range of farm sizes, farm types, all over the country for a resilient system. So diversity in the types of crops, and also diversity in our farms.
Right. And I think this kind of circles back, and Nicole, I see your hand raised, that, this circles back to sort of the topic, and the cafes are talking about how we can tell the story about our local food system and support a more resilient food system. And I think that's one of the big takeaways, is though, even though food miles technically are not the reason to have to support a local, might not be the only reason to support a local farm, there are many, many others that are as critically important. Nicole?
You're leading right into what I wanted to say, which is that I just wanted to underscore that as we transition to this part of the conversation, I think it's important to distinguish between the carbon footprint of our food choices, and so the greenhouse gas emissions associated with our food choices, where local may not be smaller, and in some cases be larger footprints, but there's a climate resilient aspect. There's building a strong local and regional food system, and that contributing to climate resilience. And those are it's a nuanced difference between those two ways of communicating about it as a network. And that's part of the reason we wanted to host this cafe today. So I'm glad we're getting to it. That's all.
Yeah. There are a couple other questions in the chat. The approximate carbon sequestration capacity comparison between forests and pastures. Allie, is that your field, maybe?
It's also outside of my area of expertise, but I will say that there is great potential for carbon sequestration in our in pasture land, that there's been a lot of great studies looking at things like applying compost and ways that we can build up soil organic matter to increase carbon sequestration in our pasture lands. But I don't know the comparison very well across the potential.
Or maybe there's someone else here that does, actually. Are there questions I missed? Anybody else have? Because we do have a question that we thought could bring for discussion. It's in the agenda. Like what messages, because we only have about 6 minutes left. What messages can we confidently and accurately communicate related to local food systems and climate-friendly diet, which I feel Nicole maybe just gave a little preview. Any, Alan? Alan, are you there?
Yeah, I'm here. I'm sorry, I missed your question. I was looking at the chat.
But your hand's raised. Is it not meant to be raised?
I think maybe I scratched my head and now
Oh.
the whole computer thing recognizes it and thinks I'll go back to mute.
Okay. I mean, I think that, I think Nicole kind of said it. It's the resilience piece. I think that is the story. It's also the economic resilience piece. So yeah, we need a strong food system, but also the food system is a really strong economic driver. Are you now raising your hand, Alan?
Yeah, actually, my colleague Rebecca White is on, and for whatever reason, it also shows my name. So I think Rebecca has my hand raised.
Thanks, Rebecca.
Hi, Nancy, can you hear me?
Yes.
Oh, great. Hi. This is a great conversation. So thank you for setting this up. It's interesting and informative. And I think that you're right, kind of the territory that we're getting into now is like, what is the value of having a local kind of more transparent food system? And I think a lot of the value that provides is we become a body of voices rather than a one consumer at a store who feels like they don't have a voice in the way that their food is produced, or they don't have an understanding of the way that it's produced even. So much of the community relationships that we have in our local food systems provide resiliency in terms of food security, but it also it ensures that we're moving as a body and we are setting the expectations and the goals for ourselves and for the way that our food is produced. And I think that what I see from a retail perspective is that a lot of decisions that farms are able to make comes from consumers pushing for that. So it's a mutually beneficial, give and take of like, well, now we need you to be a sustainable beef farmer, and how do we support you in doing that?
Great. There are now several more questions in the chat. Maybe an answer: comparison of carbon sequestration between forest and grasslands depend heavily on local conditions, like type of forest, soil, and type. So maybe there isn't just one straight up answer for that question, whoever asked that one. Jacob?
And I would say this will be the last question, just so that we can be respectful and close on time.
Yes, which I think is a good one, Jacob, if you want to share that.
Yeah, I can say it with my human voice. To all presenters today, thank you very much. And I'm curious, as we part today, if you have any tips or just resources or other organizations you can point to that are examples about how to communicate about this well with different audiences, recognizing that most people don't have an hour to sit and listen. So thank you.
So I would really suggest the Eat Lancet Commission and their brief for consumers. They have a list of bullet points that just summarizes their key takeaways, the things that they think people should know about food and the environment, and then the choices that we can make to reduce our food footprints. And so it's a really nice, clear summary, and that they've got that brief for consumers, and they've also got an equivalent for policymakers, for farmers, for food preparers, a whole range of these briefs for different audiences. So I think that one would be a great resource. And for individual consumers, also just encouraging them to calculate their own footprint with an online footprint tool, so they can get a better understanding of where they are now.
I'm assuming maybe we're wrapping up. Nicole or Colleen, do you want to do the?
Yes, I feel like we could do this all day, and I would love to, but I think we all have to get back to all the other important work that we do. I did put in the chat an evaluation that I hope you'll take and tell us how this was for you, this experience, this time together. Thank you again to Allie and to Nancy for shepherding us through this, again, complex topic. And it's a really great precursor to our next cafe, which is about reducing and repurposing food waste. So we'll have details followed up with that. And yeah, with that, please go forth onto your day. Thank you again. And I hope that we can hopefully answer some questions that were in the chat that we didn't get to, but this topic will be continued to evolve and grow as we continue on. So thank you all and have a great weekend.